This podcast is sponsored by the Institute for Rediscovering Psychoanalysis. You can learn more about the Institute and the availability of other podcasts by going to its website, www.rediscoveringpsychoanalysis.org. Rediscovering Psychoanalysis is as if it is a single word. rediscoveringpsychoanalysis.org. The title of this podcast is On Psychoanalytic Evangelism in Non-European Cultures, and it has a subtitle, Assessing the Export of Psychoanalytic Theorizing as a Neo-Colonialist Enterprise. I'm Barnaby B Barratt. I'd like to offer you two watchwords to think about as you listen to this podcast. The first is epistemicide, a contraction of epistemology and of side, meaning to kill. Epistemicide. The term, I believe, comes from the writings of Boaventura de Sousa Santos. It refers to the devaluing, censoring, or outright annihilation of a way of knowing one's own or communally lived experience. Devaluing, censoring, or outright annihilation of a way of knowing one's own or communally known lived experience by the imposition of a hegemonic worldview or a domineering and dominant way of thinking. The second watchword is naivete, which usually simply means artless, credulous, or uncritical. But I propose to expand it a little to encompass any ideological position that fails to interrogate its own positionality. Over the past century, much of the psychoanalytic movement, despite its apparent commitment to reflective thinking, is actually open to the charge of naivete. I want to make one small contribution towards the remedy of this, and this podcast is a synopsis of a more fleshed out work in progress. My background for such an effort is that I practiced psychoanalytically since 1975 in the United States. I was a training analyst just under 10 years in an American institute. I came to South Africa in 2010 to join a small group of training analysts committed to the formal establishment of a new training institute in that country. Subsequently, I've also been appointed as a supervising analyst with the Indian Psychoanalytic Society, which, as you may know, is actually the second oldest training institute in that it has been continuously operating since 1922. I've also lived and studied for extended periods in India and Thailand. So that's my background for the thesis that I'm now going to present. There's actually a triple context for the confrontation of these questions that's going to be raised in what follows. Here's the triple context. First of all, the International Psychoanalytic Association is about to announce, after all the usual politicking, backing and forthing, procrastination, it's about to announce a fourth region comprising 6 training programs in India, Australia, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and China. Africa, by the way, remains in Europe, according to the IPA's vision. Although focused rather specifically on the haughtiness of North Atlantic attitudes towards Latin America, Jacques Derrida's 1991 paper on the geopolitics of psychoanalysis sadly retains its pertinence today. By the way, in this talk I'm focused on Africa and Asia. I have little knowledge of South America, which has its own rather specific history, a diasporic history of psychoanalysis. In any way, in creating a fourth region, might one not imagine that the International Psychoanalytic Association's patronage of these Asian organizations, each of which has for some years been substantively under the benefaction of an established European or American institute, one might imagine that now permitting them to enjoy their own regional federation, that this would be an occasion for reflection on what it means to propagate a discipline in cultures that are not of its origin. Indeed, one might dare to imagine that this might even be an occasion to interrogate what it might mean to think psychoanalytically and to practice psychoanalytically outside or even beyond the discipline's Eurocentric framing. But no, one finds scant evidence that any such self-interrogation is occurring. Here's the second context for this rudimentary paper. I attended the International Psychoanalytic Association's 4th Asia Conference in Taipei in 2017. The major plenary address was delivered by the IPA's top elected official. Now, leaving aside the stumbling and almost incoherent presentation of his second-hand paper, and to be fair, the presentation was worsened by being translated into Mandarin only paragraph by paragraph, the concluding message was clear in its tone, if not in its exact wording. Psychoanalysis will teach you how to be compassionate and caring interlocutors with your fellow human beings. Apparently, these were skills assumed to be more or less unfamiliar to the audience of about 600 mental health professionals from this region. I was so troubled by the arrogance of this performance that I wrote a couple of papers questioning what is being exported when psychoanalysis is brought to cultures that are historically outside the Eurocentricity of North Atlantic thinking. Because evidently certain sorts of cultural arrogance remain unchecked, even in this allegedly post-colonial era. Here's the third contextualization. I recently had the honor of conversing with Professor Lewis Gordon, an internationally renowned scholar who has published prodigiously on the issues of racism, ideological imperialism, decoloniality, existential philosophy, and much, much more. His profound insights and his brilliant articulation of the salient questions are now freely available as a podcast that's available in the annotations section of the website I previously mentioned, www.rediscoveringpsychoanalysis.org. Gordon's ideas on coloniality and decoloniality in general, and specifically on the positioning of the discipline of psychoanalysis, have extraordinary wisdom and perspicacity. I strongly recommend study and discussion of the material he offers, for it needs to be considered in depth and detail. So now I'm just going to offer you 3 takeaways from what Gordon said as I heard them. Here's the first takeaway, which may be a bit overwhelming, but it's centrally important. One cannot hide behind the position that one set of ideas is inherently so superior in its scientificity, that is, its epistemology. This actually is the argument on which many of us raised within the Euromodern master discourse tend to choke a bit, because we were taught that science, logical empiricist and analytico-referential ways of knowing about an object of investigation, is the supreme technology of knowledge. By this I mean the Eurocentric master discourse that has held sway from the past 300 to 500 years. It takes epistemology to be first philosophy, and it's held that whether or not we know something and how we know it becomes all important. The dependence of epistemology on prior assumptions about ontology, the beingness and becomingness of what is to be investigated, gets effectively concealed. We now have to relinquish this hegemonic position because ontological assumptions, cosmologies, and philosophical anthropologies, in all their diverse cultural array, actually inform what is or is not held to be knowable, scientifically or otherwise. As Gordon powerfully insists, science does not inform philosophical anthropology, rather the reverse. That is, to repeat the point, whereas the Euromodern tradition, which is wedded to the natural attitude of subject and object, assumes the priority of knowing about being, every act of knowing actually depends on prior assumptions, underlying assumptions that are typically hidden, about the beingness and becomingness of what is to be known. We'll return to this crucial issue because it bears upon the priority of ontology over epistemology, of what we take to be being over what we consider to be valid or verifiable knowing. Here's the second takeaway. As with any discipline, psychoanalysis is actually doomed if it fails to reflect and interrogate critically its own precepts. Without such unswerving rigor, the composition of the discipline simply becomes that of dogmas that reproduce themselves ideologically and institutionally. This is far from an issue exclusive to psychoanalysis. There is a clubbiness and cultism endemic to much social and human science. But with psychoanalysis, we must assess the frequency with which we see training institutes with curricula fundamentally tailored to self-reproduction. How infrequently do we find the interrogation of basic precepts to characterize the program? Yet surely of any discipline that is known to humanity, this is what psychoanalysis should be about, the interrogation of basic precepts, yet it's not what is taught in training institutes. And additionally, we must ask, how far are the abstractions and speculations that anchor psychoanalytic dogma from the lived experience of those in the psychoanalytic process of an individualized self-interrogation? Here's takeaway number 3. When one set of ideas or teachings is introduced into a culture to which it is strange, if it is not to be a hegemonic act of presumptive power-mongering, or worse, it is crucial for the introducer to be receptive to and engage in dialogue with the ideas prevalent in the culture into which it is being implanted or injected. But rarely, if ever, do we find the evangelist listening receptively to the inherent wisdom of those upon whom he, I use the male pronoun advisedly, wishes to impose his message. Despite the lopsided correspondence over several years in the early 1920s between Sigmund Freud and Chandrasekhar Bose, although maybe because of it, the psychoanalytic movement has had conspicuously little interest in learning from non-European ontologies and cosmologies. It's true, there is a psychoanalytic literature on comparative mythopoetics, most notably how the manifest configurations of Oedipal narratives are culturally variant. But I have yet to find a psychoanalytic training institute that takes seriously the study of the indigenous healing systems of the global South. What would it look like if, instead of angling to bring quote-unquote psychoanalytic enlightenment to these quote-unquote dark continents, which is the term Freud famously used to describe women and which was probably borrowed from the archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann's characterization of Africa, what would it look like if instead the psychoanalytic movement listened to what might be learned from their indigenous wisdom? How might our discipline need to change if we reconstituted ourselves in this manner? In this podcast, I'm not talking about the psychoanalytic method. I define this method as a radicalized method of listening, or learning to listen, or listening to listen, grounded in free associative discourse, the empathic address of resistances to it, and the unswerving confrontation of repetition compulsivity within the experiential here and now of the healing relationship, I've discussed this method in a whole series of books, but I'm wanting instead to examine the various psychoanalytic theories, the conceptual frameworks or philosophical axes by which interpretations are generated. And I'm going to touch critically on 4: the ego-psychological, the object-relational, the self-relational, which includes the social or interpersonal, and the Lacanian. I'm going to insist that we have to think beyond the customary categories of cross-cultural research. Rather, we have to consider how the Euro-modern master discourse shaped the trajectory of psychoanalytic theorizing after 1915, and thus how psychoanalytic theories might foreclose the vistas of indigenous wisdoms. Typically, when academics and scholars have considered the relevance of psychoanalytic theories of the human condition to non-European communities, they've focused on particular ideas, concrete ideas. There's a very sizable literature of comparative investigation in the cross-cultural mode, and it's of limited relevance when we consider the questions which I'm now wanting to bring into focus. We now know well that some cultures are more communal, others more individualistic, that what is suppressed and repressed varies considerably depending on the social codes of what is forbidden, and thus that the contours of Oedipal complexities are quite varied. We know that some cultures wean their babies abruptly and early, whereas others make it a languorous procedure. That most cultures embrace processes of listening to a spirit world, whereas the normative, secular rationality of the so-called Western world tends to dismiss such practices as pre-modern hocus-pocus, rubbish, and so on. Reading in the almost humongous ethnographic literature of what used to be called psychoanalytic anthropology, and maybe still is, yields a wealth of interesting findings. Under the tutelage of Professor Johnny Whiting at Harvard, I was trained in the use of Yale University's Human Relations Area files to accomplish comparative research of this sort. And by the way, these files, which used to be housed in a vast array of index cards, are now digitized and freely available. Such research has contributed mightily to our understanding of the diversity of human cultures. It's surely interesting at the very least to know what percentage of human cultures circumcise their males and what percentage do it in infancy or at post-puberty or in adulthood. It's surely interesting to know what percentage of cultures condone or encourage penile vaginal intercourse as soon as it acquires its reproductive capacity, whereas others attempt to delay the onset of such behavior. Which progeny will be nurtured and which will be sacrificed, according to the prevailing rules of different cultures? Are women to be exiled as contaminated during their menses, or are they to be celebrated, and so on and so forth? As important as such an expansive view of the diversity of social arrangements in human cultures is, I have yet to hear of any psychoanalytic institute that teaches its candidates to any significant extent this sort of material. Yet it seems vital to an appreciation of the diversity of psychodynamic conflictual patterns across the globe. However, even if such teaching were to be integrated into psychoanalytic training, and I believe it should be, it's not enough, because the approach of psychoanalytic anthropology cannot be said to have contributed to our understanding of the way intercultural dialogue might be undertaken without it being an exercise in which everything is measured against the standards of white, middle-class, North Atlantic normativity, which, sad to say, is inherently and ultimately the tenor of many or most of these cross-cultural research endeavors. I think we need to step back and interrogate what I will call the Euro-modern precepts of psychoanalytic theorizing. That is, even to go beyond some of the most useful writings in this area, I'm thinking here of Sally Schwartz's Psychoanalysis and Colonialism, Daniel Jose Gaztambide's Decolonizing Psychoanalytic Technique, or the important contributions of Derek Hook, to which I am somewhat appreciatively but critically aligned, and so on. Here's a strategy different from that of Schwartz or Gaztambide. Following scholars who follow the writings of Michel Foucault and others, Timothy Rees is one of my favorites. It's not overly controversial to argue that the early Euromodern era, from the 16th to 18th centuries, and the late Euromodern era, from the 19th to 20th centuries, were governed by a master discourse that has specific features and philosophers that are clearly associated with the rise of North Atlantic capitalism, with technological advances that are at times impressive, at times terrifying, and with the project of colonialist expansion. It's predicated, the master discourse is predicated upon presumptions about the primacy of epistemology and about the nature of reality. It's a master discourse that has bequeathed us several ontological and epistemological binaries, that of reason being identified with the dichotomy of rationality and irrationality, perhaps being one of the most salient and the most pernicious. Consider George Hegel's famous aphorism from the early 19th century. It appears in his 1817 Encyclopedia and in his 1921 Philosophy of Right. The real is rational, and the rational is real. That is, we insist that everything that exists has a logical structure and is ultimately representable, and hence can sooner or later be brought within the purview of reflective self-consciousness, and that it is thus obedient to a certain sort of reason. Do we need to note that the criteria for such a logical structure were those set by white European men, and that the possibilities of other logics or otherwise lawfulness or lawlessness were presumptively excluded? Thus, within the Euromodern master discourse, both early and late, nothing exists if it cannot be represented or represented within the rationality of North Atlantic thinking. Note in passing the hidden presuppositions about the unicity and reiterative linearity of time. Things must be representable. Yet surely the radical praxis of free association leads us to know experientially that we can appreciate an awareness of forces acting upon us that will never be representable in our supposedly purely rational or ultimately rational self-consciousness. So then we come to the cracks that show up within the Euromodern era. The exclusivist rationality of Euromodern discourse has been found by several different lineages of 20th century philosophy to have no secure foundations. Treated as an absolute, the platform of its absolutism has proven shaky. As I discussed in my 1994 book, Freud is a major figure in this crumbling of the Euromodern episteme. For in his early writings he demonstrates concretely how, in the passage of free associative discourse, nothing is purely irrational, and that everything that seems to us to be impeccably rational is actually embroidered and enmeshed within the other and otherwiseness of that which is nominally irrational. However, the project of the logical empiricist or analytico-referential master discourse, as it's been called, is ongoing, and within the human sciences has egregiously been carried forward by the four main axes of psychoanalytic theorizing that I just mentioned. Additionally, we should note in passing how the hegemony of Euromodern epistemology has been, and still is, wedded to a project of what Professor Galton calls purification, as a mode of operation derived mainly from Judeo-Christian Islamic theologies. That is, it has been assumed in trenchantly imperialist fashion that irrationalities are not only to be othered and condemned, but also to be expunged as if weeds in the garden. We can't go much further into this except to say that the hegemony of Euromodern epistemology has carried with it the dissemination of a certain set of moral codes, again mostly derived from Judeo-Christian Islamic institutions, that are then imposed upon the colonized. Remember here the condescension I described in the IPA official speech to Asian mental health providers. Let's now point to 3 features of the Euromodern master discourse that effectively preclude or subjugate ways of knowing and being that diverge from its hegemony. These features have, as I hope to suggest, distorted the history of psychoanalytic theorizing, that is, the 4 frameworks or axes of interpretation that I just mentioned: ego-psychological, object-relational, self-psychological or social interpersonal, and the Lacanian. 3 features. Feature number 1. The first feature is the equation of knowledge with domination. This disposes of what might be called wisdom by conflating knowing something as having power over it. My undergraduate training in social psychology came at the tail end of the profession's infamous infatuation with behaviorism, which is arguably the nadir of science in market capitalism. We were led to believe, almost ad nauseam, that to be able to control and predict the behavior of a phenomenon, that is, to be able to manipulate its behavior, is to know the object. Think what this implies in ontological terms. The object itself has no voice, inasmuch as its being is conceptually and ontologically robbed of its own momentum of becomingness. Consider here the contrast. On the one hand, knowing as having power over, involving the collection of informational data about the other in order to construct a model of its functioning, and thence to have power over its future, that is, to subjugate it. On the other hand, we might consider knowing as receptivity, knowing as learning to listen to the messages that come from a spatio-temporal locus of otherness, and to allow these messages not so much to inform us representationally so that we can create models about it, but to reform us at the heart of our awareness of who we are. Knowledge as domination is a motif of psychoanalytic history, greatly reinforced by the unfortunate alliance of this discipline with the ontology of allopathic medicine. I like to joke about allopathic medicine and say that the patient is basically a cadaver that happens to be alive. Something's not functioning properly in the patient, who's a collection of anatomical structures and physiological functions, and it's the task of the doctor to repair it. How frequently do supposedly psychoanalytic practitioners operate with the attitude that there's something wrong with the patient and it's their job to fix it interpretively? How many training institutes teach diagnostic formulation, and why do they do so? And then secondarily, as if derivatively, they teach clinical technique, even though from my standpoint, diagnosis has no role in psychoanalytic discourse and psychoanalytic process has no technique. As a method or praxis, psychoanalysis is not a technological procedure in which the subject manipulates its object. It's not a matter of domination, of an application of theoretical concepts only to the lived experience of the patient. Rather, it is a method, not an application, not a technique, but a method, which is very much of that of learning to listen. Learning to listen by holding in abeyance, as radically as is feasible, all theoretical preconceptions. This perspective has been entirely lost in the Euromodern enthusiasm to develop the various frameworks or axes of theorizing the mind, ego psychology, object relations, and so on. Herein lies the authoritarianism of most therapeutic techniques or treatments that pass themselves off as psychoanalytically informed. The practitioner is the one who knows. The patient is the one who is known about, and supposedly comes to benefit from conveyance of the practitioner's knowledge of a theoretical system that generates interpretations. Happily, it is implicitly and sometimes explicitly suggested that the patient should come to adopt this theoretical framework for the purposes of self-interpretation in an ongoing manner. We could speak here about Lacanianism, which was an earnest effort to escape the directives of the practitioner as the one who knows. Refusing the role of the sujet supposé savoir, the Lacanian psychoanalyst poses as the deathful void into which we all speak, whether we know it or not. Yet, as is now nefariously evident, Lacanianism was institutionally bedeviled by its own determination to elude authoritarianism, succumbing as it did to the authority of the master, which is ultimately that of the phallus. Here is feature number 2 of the way the Euromodern discourse has affected the construction of psychoanalytic theories. It brings us to the motif of mastery. Freud was quite clear 3 times in his published writings, with little or no wavering or ambiguity, that one cannot or even should not aspire to master oneself. Subsequent psychoanalytic theorizing, however, has repeatedly tried to reassert the illusion of the discrete individual's autonomy or potential self-sovereignty, that is, of the individual's possibility of self-integrated self-governance, extracting the individual from the influences over forces over which it can have no control. This is a far cry from Ubuntu, Nugumuntu, Nigabantu. A person is a person by means of other people. Within ego psychology, the cult of the discrete individual's autonomy accelerated with Heinz Hartmann's inauguration of the so-called conflict-free sphere of ego functioning. With object relations, the image of a psyche in control both of its destructive cravings and of its enmeshed tendencies towards projection and introjection is routinely conjured. Obviously, the social, relational, interpersonal schools might claim to evade this criticism of mastery. But then again, the aspirational sovereignty of the individual mind is assumed, although formed via endless me-you conversations. There is again an ambition of dialogic mastery that preempts the listening to forces otherwise than that which can be represented. With Lacanianism, individual self-mastery is rightly dismissed as an impossibility. The fate of the I is already determined by chains of pre-established signifiers, and the self is little but a paranoid construct. This school obviously has greater complexity and sophistication than the other 3 that I'm mentioning, and I cannot detail it here. Suffice it to say that the same ontological function is achieved via the abstractive notion of the absolute phallus, which is immutable and all-governing. Finally, feature number 3 of the way in which the Euromodern master discourse has affected psychoanalytic theory construction. My third feature of the way in which psychoanalysis has since its revolutionary beginnings as a praxis of listening, been theoretically remodeled, mistakenly, as a theory-driven procedure of interpretation, in line with Euromodern epistemology. To reiterate, this concerns the ontological assumptions about reality that operate prior to epistemological procedures. What I'm trying to emphasize here is the way in which these assumptions entail the foreclosure or preclusion of forces that are presumptively ruled unreal. As I indicated earlier, the Euromodern era installed hegemonically dichotomies that psychoanalytic praxis itself implodes: rationality, irrationality, internal, external, me, other are leading examples. But foremost, at least in terms of the appreciation of lived experience, what is ontologically significant is the assumption that things or events are either material, which means physical, or immaterial, which means mental, and also that they cannot be both. What this precludes precisely is the notion of subtle energies, including Freud's own notion, which he argued to about 1914 and surreptitiously dropped or masked as biologically founded drives thereafter. Freud's own notion that there must be systems of psychic energy that operate between biology and psychology, between the physicality of neurons and the mentality of representations, and yet that somehow influence or impact both realms. What I'm emphasizing, a point that's not especially controversial among scholars of intellectual history, is that the installation of the Euromodern episteme, its resolve, if you will, was precisely to expurgate medieval awareness of the forces of some sort of spirit that both impacts us and moves within us. Such subtle energies do not and cannot exist, so it has been insisted, within Euromodern discourse, and also within the four frames of theorizing in psychoanalysis. So what I'm also indicating is that these four schools of psychoanalytic theorizing were precisely developed to rule out the notion of psychic energy as a subtle energy system, and thus to make the discipline solely concerned with the substrate of biology and the domain of psychology, or representationality. Yet oddly, or not so oddly, everyone outside the Euromodern episteme believes in the operation of subtle energies and in our capacity to have some awareness of their operation, even if they perpetually evade captivation in the representationality of our self-consciousness. Think here of pneuma from ancient Greek philosophy and the Septuagint. Think of prana or chi or mana, and most close to home in southern Africa of our Nguni notion of umoya. These insights pervade all known indigenous cosmologies, as well as the mainstream traditions of Taoism, of the Sensib system of healing in Thailand, and of the diverse doctrines of Sanatana Dharma, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, as well as the most ancient Zoroastrian writings. I'm not suggesting that these notions are all one and the same, although it's tempting to do so. What I am insisting is that what the theoretical developments of ego psychology, object relations, and self-relational, social or interpersonal therapies, as well as the Lacanian clinic, what they all have in common is a theoretical expunction of the notion of subtle energies that act within and upon us, and that are neither equivalent to the material substrate of our biology nor to the realm of our representational capacity for self-consciousness. As well as the expunction of the notion of subtle energies, as well as the notion that we can be aware of the movement of such energies even if we cannot represent them self-consciously. I want to make two last points. First, what's suggested here is not so much a plea for greater open-mindedness toward the teachings of indigenous peoples, although that would be good. Rather, what's the insistence that psychoanalysis must critically interrogate the precepts of its own theory-driven interpretive commitments, the precepts that prevent awareness of the subtle energies that connect us internally and externally with the cosmos. The second point, what indigenous teachings tend to emphasize is not only that there can be a cosmic awareness, not a representational consciousness, but a cosmic awareness of subtle energies, but also emphasized is that these energies can lodge themselves in our embodiment as knots of energetic congestion, obstructions. Body workers well know of this, and it becomes imperative for us as psychoanalysts to ally ourselves more closely with their wisdom. Indeed, to free the discipline from the disembodied attitudes that have characterized its history. Free ourselves from the misguided assumption that the body is or can be under the governance of the mind, or that these arenas are separable. Thus, we must move towards a psychoanalytic praxis that attends to the dynamics of our erotic embodiment and does not try to sideline, ignore, or preclude these dynamics theoretically, which is what in different ways ego psychology, object relations, self or interpersonal psychology, and Lacanianism have all done. So in this podcast, I focused on the suggestion that prognostically, psychoanalytic theory, not method, but rather the therapeutic discipline that prioritizes the arrival at interpretations over the deconstructive processes of ongoing learning to listen, is doomed, unless it reopens itself to the possibility that subtle energies exist and that we're able to develop an awareness of them, and that they are crucial to genuine healing. Why is this so challenging? After all, we live in an era in which hard science talks not only of dynamic nonlinear complexities and the uncertainty principle, but also of forces of action at a distance, of quantum interference, non-locality and particle entanglement, of tunneling effects, of gluons and quarks of different flavors, and so on. One would think that this context makes it more possible for psychoanalytic theorists to see and understand how enclosed they have become. Most hopefully, this all calls for psychoanalysis as a discipline to interrogate itself critically, to cease being so fragmented yet self-enclosed and enclosing in its theoretical constructions. It calls for the discipline to bring itself into a conversation, rather than a haughty, dismissive attitude, with the wisdom of indigenous modes of healing, as well as embodied modes of healing. To have a viable future, particularly in non-European cultures, psychoanalysts must listen, respectfully but not undiscerningly, to the healing practices of the shamans. In this way, psychoanalysis might make a contribution to an urgent task. It might do so, but it is far from doing so at present. The task is an urgent change in the way humans think about the challenges of being human, how we think about the human condition. The task, as Professor Lewis Gordon and his colleagues phrase it, is no less than that of shifting the geographies of reason.